The whispers followed Cordelia Jenkins like shadows in the dusty streets of Silver Creek, a small settlement nestled between the untamed plains and the looming mountains of Wyoming Territory, 1875. She moved with quiet determination, her skirts rustling against the boardwalk as townsfolk turned to stare. Not a single word escaped her lips, but the defiance in her eyes spoke volumes as she carried her basket of supplies from the general store. "There goes the mute girl," someone muttered, just loud enough for Cordelia to hear. "Pretty as a picture, but strange as they come." Cordelia kept her gaze fixed forward, pretending the words didn't cut deep. She'd grown accustomed to the sidelong glances and hushed comments since arriving in Silver Creek 3 months ago. The town had welcomed her father, the new schoolteacher, with open arms, but they regarded Cordelia with suspicion. A woman of 22 who didn't speak was an oddity they couldn't quite figure out. It hadn't always been this way. Once, her voice had rung clear as a bell until the night of the fire that took her mother and her speech. The doctors called it shock, said her voice might return someday. Her father called it God's mysterious ways. Cordelia simply stopped trying to explain. She quickened her pace, eager to escape the prying eyes of Silver Creek's residents. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and perspiration gathered at the nape of her neck beneath her carefully pinned chestnut hair. As she rounded the corner near the livery stable, she collided with a solid wall of cotton and leather. Her basket tumbled from her grasp, spilling its contents across the dirt. Cordelia dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered items before they were ruined. A pair of worn leather boots entered her line of vision, and a tanned hand reached down to retrieve a tin of coffee that had rolled away. "My apologies, miss. Didn't see you coming around that corner." Cordelia looked up, squinting against the sun to make out the face of the man standing before her. Tall and broad-shouldered, he cut an imposing figure against the bright sky. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his Stetson, but she could see the strong line of his jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of a clear summer sky. Yates Kingsley had been in Silver Creek for only 2 weeks, hired as a ranch hand at the Rockingham Ranch outside of town. He knelt beside Cordelia, helping gather her belongings. When she didn't respond to his apology, he glanced at her curiously. "You all right, miss? Didn't hurt you, did I?" Cordelia shook her head, reaching for the tin he held. Their fingers brushed, and she withdrew her hand as if burned. She kept her eyes downcast, wishing she could disappear. "That's the Jenkins girl," a voice called out from the doorway of the livery. "Don't waste your breath, Kingsley. She don't talk, mute as a fence post." Yates turned toward the speaker, a stable hand named Perry. "Didn't ask for your commentary," he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made Perry retreat back into the stable. Cordelia had finished collecting her things and stood, clutching her basket tightly. She offered a small nod of thanks, already stepping around him to continue on her way. "Hold on," Yates said, reaching out but stopping short of touching her arm. "Don't mind them. Folks around here seem to have forgotten their manners." Cordelia paused, unsure how to respond. Most people gave up trying to converse with her after realizing she couldn't reply. Yates studied her face, noting the intelligence in her deep brown eyes and the stubborn set of her chin. "Your eyes speak loud enough," he said softly. "They're saying you'd like me to step aside so you can be on your way." Surprise flickered across Cordelia's features before she could mask it. She gave a hesitant nod. "Well then, Miss Jenkins." He tipped his hat and stepped aside. "Hope to see you around town again." Cordelia hurried away, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. The encounter left her unsettled in a way she couldn't quite define. She was accustomed to being an object of curiosity or pity, but the cowboy had looked at her as if her silence was inconsequential, as if he could see beyond it to the person underneath. The small house she shared with her father sat on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling befitting a schoolteacher's salary. Inside, Benjamin Jenkins looked up from his books as his daughter entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "There you are, Cordy. I was beginning to worry. He took the basket from her hands. Did you get everything we needed? Cordelia nodded, reaching into her pocket for the small slate she carried. She quickly wrote, "Ran into someone, everything fine." Her father's smile faltered slightly. "No trouble, I hope." She shook her head, taking the basket back and moving to put away the supplies. Benjamin watched her with concern etched into the lines of his face. He'd done his best since Mary's death, but he worried constantly about his silent daughter's future in a world that had little patience for those who were different. "I've invited Reverend Harper for supper tomorrow," he said casually. "He's been asking after you." Cordelia stiffened, her back to her father as she placed cans on the shelf. She knew what this meant. At 38, the Reverend was a widower looking for a new wife, and her father was looking for someone to care for Cordelia when he was gone. She turned slowly, her expression resolute as she shook her head firmly. "Cordy, please, he's a good man, he wouldn't mind your condition." She pulled out her slate and wrote quickly, "I am not a condition to be tolerated." Benjamin sighed, removing his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose. "I only want you to be cared for, protected." Cordelia's expression softened. She wrote again, "I know, but not him, not anyone. I am content as I am." It wasn't entirely true. There were nights when loneliness pressed in on her like a physical weight, when she longed for companionship beyond her father's well-meaning but fretful presence. But she'd resigned herself to solitude rather than becoming someone's burden. "Well," Benjamin conceded, "at least join us for supper." "It would be rude to leave me entertaining alone." Cordelia nodded, knowing this small battle was won but the war would continue. Her father wouldn't stop trying to secure her future, and the Reverend wouldn't be the last prospective husband paraded before her. That night, as she brushed her hair before bed, Cordelia found her thoughts drifting to the cowboy from the livery. Yates Kingsley, an unusual name, strong like its owner. She remembered how he'd defended her against the stable hand's crude comment, how he'd seemed to understand her without words passing between them. "Your eyes speak loud enough," he'd said. In a world where she'd grown accustomed to being overlooked or dismissed, his words had pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. She set down her brush and extinguished the lamp, knowing such thoughts were dangerous. A man like that, young, handsome, whole, would have no interest in a woman who couldn't even call his name. The brief connection she'd felt was merely kindness on his part, nothing more. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, his face appeared in her mind's eye, and for the first time in years, Cordelia allowed herself to wonder. What if dawn broke crisp and clear over the Rockingham ranch? Yates had been up since before sunrise, helping to ready the horses for a day of checking fence lines. The work was straightforward but demanding, just what he needed to clear his head. "You're mighty quiet this morning," observed Marcus Monroe, the ranch owner, as they saddled their mounts side by side. "Just thinking," Yates replied, tightening the cinch on his bay gelding. "Dangerous habit for a cowboy," Marcus chuckled. "What's got you so pensive?" "Not regretting taking this job, I hope." "Not at all. Silver Creek suits me fine." Yates paused, then added, "Met an interesting woman yesterday. Jenkins, I believe, was her name." Marcus's bushy eyebrows rose. "Benjamin Jenkins's daughter, the mute girl." "She doesn't speak," Yates corrected, a hint of sharpness in his tone. "Doesn't make her any less of a person." "No offense intended," Marcus held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just surprised she caught your attention." "Pretty thing, but folks say she's been that way since she and her father arrived from back east. Some tragedy, I heard. Mother died in a fire." Yates swung up into the saddle, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "Not our business to speculate." "True enough," Marcus agreed, mounting his own horse. "Though if you're sweet on her, you should know Reverend Harper's been calling at their house. Word is Benjamin Jenkins is looking to see his daughter settled." The news shouldn't have bothered Yates. He barely knew the woman, but he felt an unexpected flare of irritation at the thought of the self-righteous Reverend courting Cordelia Jenkins. He'd seen Harper in town, a man who preached humility on Sundays while looking down his nose at anyone he deemed beneath him the rest of the week. "Let's get moving," Yates said, turning his horse toward the north pasture. "Daylight's wasting." As they rode, Yates found his thoughts returning to Cordelia's expressive eyes. He'd meant what he said they spoke volumes. Fear, defiance, resignation, and beneath it all, a fierce intelligence. He'd grown up with a sister who lost her hearing after a fever, so he'd learned young that words weren't the only way to communicate. Elizabeth had taught him to read expressions, gestures, the unspoken language of the body. He wondered what had silenced Cordelia Jenkins. Was it the trauma of losing her mother, as Marcus suggested? Or something else entirely? By mid-afternoon, they'd checked most of the northern fence line and were heading back toward the ranch house when they spotted a plume of smoke rising from the direction of Silver Creek. "That's not right," Marcus said, pulling up his horse. "Too much smoke for cooking fires." Yates felt a curl of dread in his stomach. "Fire," he said grimly, "and with this wind." They didn't need to say more. Both men spurred their horses toward town, the urgency of their mission communicated in the thunder of hooves against the hard, packed earth. The scene that greeted them as they rode into Silver Creek was one of controlled chaos. A building on the eastern edge of town, the schoolhouse, Yates realized with a jolt was engulfed in flames. Townspeople had formed a bucket brigade from the well, passing water hand to hand in a desperate attempt to contain the blaze. Yates and Marcus dismounted quickly, tying their horses to a hitching post well away from the commotion before running to join the effort. As Yates took his place in line, accepting a bucket from a soot-streaked woman, he scanned the crowd anxiously. "Is everyone out?" he asked, passing the bucket to the next person. "Think so," the woman replied between labored breaths. "School was empty, thank the Lord. Benjamin Jenkins was inside working, but they got him out." Relief flooded through Yates, followed immediately by concern. "Jenkins, is he all right?" Breathed in a lot of smoke. They took him to Doc Simmons's place. Yates continued passing buckets, but his mind was elsewhere. If Benjamin Jenkins was injured, Cordelia would be at the doctor's office with her father. The thought of her facing another tragedy involving fire twisted something in his chest. It took nearly 2 hours to extinguish the blaze, by which time the schoolhouse was little more than a charred skeleton. Exhausted and filthy, Yates made his way to the doctor's office on the main street, not entirely sure why he felt compelled to check on a man and a woman he barely knew. The waiting room was crowded with concerned townspeople when he arrived. He spotted Cordelia immediately, sitting rigidly in a chair by the examination room door, her face pale but composed. Reverend Harper sat beside her, one hand patting hers in what Yates supposed was meant to be a comforting gesture, though Cordelia's stiff posture suggested she found it anything but. Yates hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of his disheveled appearance and unsure of his welcome. As if sensing his presence, Cordelia looked up, and their eyes met across the room. Something flickered in her gaze, recognition, relief, he couldn't be sure before she quickly looked away. The Reverend noticed the exchange and frowned slightly, his hand tightening over Cordelia's. Yates approached anyway, removing his hat as he crossed the room. "Miss Jenkins," he said with a respectful nod. "I heard about your father. How is he?" Reverend Harper answered before Cordelia could respond in her own way. "Benjamin is resting comfortably. Dr. Simmons says with time and care he should recover fully." His tone suggested Yates's concern was unnecessary and unwelcome. Yates kept his eyes on Cordelia. "That's good news," he said quietly. Cordelia nodded, slipping her hand free from the Reverend's grasp to reach for her slate. She wrote quickly and held it up. "Thank you for helping with the fire." "I wish I could have done more," Yates replied honestly. "The schoolhouse." She wrote again, "Just a building, father is safe, that's what matters." "Indeed," the Reverend interjected, clearly displeased at being excluded from the exchange. "Providence was watching over Benjamin today. Now Mr. Kingsley," Yates supplied. "Yates Kingsley. Mr. Kingsley." While your concern is commendable, Miss Jenkins has had quite a shock. I'm sure you understand that this is a time for family and close friends." The dismissal was clear, but before Yates could respond, the doctor's door opened and a tired-looking man in his 50s emerged. "He's asking for you, Cordelia," Dr. Simmons said kindly. "He's weak but alert." Cordelia rose immediately, tucking her slate under her arm. She hesitated, glancing at Yates, then the Reverend, before slipping past the doctor into the examination room. "Reverend Harper," the doctor continued, "you might want to go in as well. Benjamin mentioned needing to speak with you about arrangements for his recovery." The Reverend nodded, casting a final meaningful look at Yates before following Cordelia. As the door closed behind him, Yates felt a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, son," Marcus said. "Nothing more to be done here today. Let's get back to the ranch." Yates allowed himself to be led away, though his thoughts remained with the silent woman and her injured father. Something told him this was far from the last time their paths would cross. Inside the examination room, Benjamin Jenkins lay propped up on pillows, his face ashen beneath a layer of soot. His breathing was labored but steady, and he managed a weak smile as Cordelia rushed to his side. "I'm all right, Cordy," he assured her, taking her trembling hand in his. "Just a bit of smoke." Cordelia's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand. The smell of smoke that clung to him triggered memories she'd spent years trying to suppress: another fire, another hospital room, only that time her mother hadn't survived. "Miss Jenkins has been quite concerned," Reverend Harper said, coming to stand at the foot of the bed. "We all have." Benjamin's expression grew serious. "The school, I'm afraid it's gone," the Reverend replied solemnly, "but buildings can be rebuilt. We're just thankful you escaped with your life." "The books," Benjamin murmured. "All those books." Cordelia reached for her slate, writing quickly, "Don't worry about that now, rest." Benjamin read her message and nodded tiredly. "Dr. Simmons says I need to stay here for a few days, my lungs." He trailed off, coughing weakly. "Of course," Reverend Harper said smoothly. "And I've already assured him that I'll see to your daughter's welfare during your convalescence. It wouldn't be proper for her to stay alone." Alarm flashed across Cordelia's face. She shook her head vehemently, writing on her slate, "I will be fine at home. I'm not a child." "Propriety must be considered, my dear," the Reverend insisted. "A young, unmarried woman alone, people would talk." "Cordelia," Benjamin said gently, "perhaps the Reverend is right. You could stay with Mrs. Hollister," or Cordelia's hand moved furiously across the slate. "I will not be passed around like an unwanted parcel. I can care for myself." The Reverend's lips thinned with disapproval. "Such stubborn independence is hardly becoming in a woman, Miss Jenkins. Your father needs peace of mind to recover." Cordelia felt trapped, the walls of the small room closing in around her. She'd fought so hard for what little independence she had, and now, because of another fire, it was being threatened. She looked at her father's worried face and knew she couldn't add to his burden, but the thought of being under Reverend Harper's watchful eye made her skin crawl. A soft knock interrupted the tense silence. Dr. Simmons opened the door to reveal Yates Kingsley standing in the waiting room, hat in hand. "Excuse the interruption," the doctor said, "but Mr. Kingsley has a suggestion that might resolve your housing dilemma." Benjamin gestured weakly for Yates to enter. The cowboy stepped into the room, nodding respectfully to everyone present before addressing Benjamin directly. "Mr. Jenkins, I couldn't help overhearing your predicament," Yates began. "I've spoken with my employer, Marcus Monroe. He and his wife would be pleased to offer Miss Jenkins a place to stay at the Rocking M until you're recovered. Mrs. Monroe is a respectable woman, and their daughter Emily would welcome the company. It's only 3 miles from town, so Miss Jenkins could visit you daily." Cordelia stared at Yates in astonishment. She barely knew this man, yet he'd gone out of his way to offer a solution that preserved both propriety and her independence. Reverend Harper's frown deepened. "That's very presumptuous of you, Mr. Kingsley." The Monroes are fine people, but surely it's a generous offer, Benjamin interrupted, studying Yates with newfound interest. You work for Marcus, you say? Yes, sir. Been with him 2 weeks now, but we go back further. Rode with his outfit in Colorado before he settled here. I know Marcus, Benjamin said thoughtfully. Good man, straight shooter. He turned to Cordelia. What do you think, Cordy? Would that arrangement suit you better? All eyes turned to Cordelia as she considered her options. Staying with the Monroe strangers, but kind ones by all accounts, would be preferable to the Reverend's scrutiny or being treated like a child by the town's well-meaning widows. And if she were honest with herself, the prospect of being near Yates Kingsley wasn't entirely unwelcome. She wrote on her slate, "If Mrs. Monroe truly doesn't mind, I accept with gratitude." Reverend Harper looked as if he'd bitten into something sour, but he managed a tight smile. Well, if that's settled, I'll take my leave. Benjamin, I'll return tomorrow to check on your progress. He nodded curtly to the others and departed, his displeasure evident in every line of his rigid posture. I should let you rest, Yates said to Benjamin. With your permission, I'll return tomorrow with Mrs. Monroe to help Miss Jenkins gather her things. Benjamin nodded, his eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion and medication. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley. It seems we're in your debt. Not at all, sir, Yates replied, his eyes meeting Cordelia's briefly, just being neighborly. As Yates left the room, Cordelia felt a curious mixture of trepidation and anticipation. Her carefully ordered world had been upended in the space of a few hours, and she was being thrust into unfamiliar territory. Yet something about Yates Kingsley's steady gaze and quiet consideration made her think that perhaps, just perhaps, this upheaval might lead to unexpected possibilities. The next morning dawned cool and clear, the devastation of the schoolhouse fire stark in the morning light. Cordelia had spent a restless night at the doctor's office, dozing in a chair beside her father's bed, refusing to leave despite Dr. Simmons's assurances that Benjamin would be well looked after. She was washing her face in a basin of cold water when a soft knock sounded at the door. Dr. Simmons answered it, admitting Yates and a woman Cordelia presumed was Mrs. Monroe. Eliza Monroe was a handsome woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a practical manner. She approached Cordelia with an outstretched hand and a warm smile. Miss Jenkins, I'm Eliza Monroe. I'm so sorry about your father's accident and the school. Marcus and I would be pleased to have you stay with us until your father is back on his feet. Cordelia shook the offered hand, nodding gratefully. She reached for her slate, wrote a quick note of thanks, and held it up. No need for thanks, Eliza said after reading the message. Any friend of Yates is welcome at our table. Now, shall we go to your home so you can pack what you'll need? Cordelia glanced at her father, who was awake and watching the exchange with evident relief. Go on, Cordy, he said, his voice still rough from smoke inhalation. Mrs. Monroe will take good care of you. I'll be up and about before you know it. She squeezed his hand, trying to convey all her love and concern in that simple gesture before gathering her shawl and slate. Yates hung back, allowing the women to precede him from the room. Mr. Kingsley, Benjamin called weakly. A moment, please. Yates approached the bed as Cordelia and Eliza stepped into the hallway. Yes, sir, Benjamin fixed him with a penetrating stare that belied his weakened state. My daughter is precious to me. Her silence makes her vulnerable in ways others might not understand. I understand better than most, Mr. Jenkins. My sister lost her hearing as a child, taught me that words aren't the only way to communicate. Surprise flickered across Benjamin's face, followed by cautious approval. Then you know she's not to be pitied or patronized. No, sir. Your daughter strikes me as a woman of remarkable strength and intelligence. Benjamin studied him for a long moment before nodding. See that the Monroes understand that as well, and Mr. Kingsley, thank you. Yates tipped his hat respectfully. Rest easy, sir, we'll look after her. Outside, Cordelia stood on the boardwalk with Eliza, her posture tense as people passed by, some offering sympathetic nods, others openly curious about her presence with the rancher's wife. "I've brought the wagon," Yates explained as he joined them. "Thought it would be easier for carrying your things, Miss Jenkins." The short journey to the Jenkins' modest home was made in comfortable silence. Eliza chatted easily about the ranch and her 18-year-old daughter Emily, seemingly unbothered by Cordelia's inability to respond verbally. Yates drove the wagon, occasionally glancing at Cordelia, who sat between them on the bench seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. At the house, Cordelia moved efficiently, packing a carpetbag with clothing and necessities. She hesitated before a small bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of well-loved volumes. "Bring as many as you'd like," Eliza encouraged. "We're not short on space and Emily loves to read as well. The two of you should get along famously." Cordelia selected 3 books, adding them carefully to her bag. As she glanced around the small room that had been her sanctuary, her eye caught on a portrait of her mother that sat on her bedside table. She picked it up gently, wrapping it in a shawl before placing it in her bag. "Is that your mother?" Yates asked from the doorway where he'd been waiting respectfully. Cordelia nodded, her expression softening with memory. "You have her eyes," he observed quietly. The simple comment touched Cordelia deeply. Most people avoided mentioning her mother, unsure how to navigate the tragedy that had silenced her. She reached for her slate, writing quickly, "You're very kind, not kind, just truthful." He offered a small smile before stepping back. "I'll wait outside with the wagon when you're ready." As Yates retreated, Eliza watched the exchange with interest. "He's a good man," she said casually, helping Cordelia fold a dress. "Not like some cowboys who drift through these parts. Marcus thinks highly of him." Cordelia kept her expression neutral, though she felt a flicker of curiosity about the taciturn cowboy, who seemed to understand her better than people who'd known her for months. Soon, her bag was packed and the small house secured. As Yates loaded her carpetbag into the wagon, Cordelia cast one last glance at the home she'd shared with her father. She would return, she reminded herself. This was temporary. Yet as the wagon pulled away, Cordelia couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in her carefully ordered existence. For better or worse, the fire had set her on a new path, one that intersected with Yates Kingsley's in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The Rocking M Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of prime grazing land, with a 2-story main house that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. As they approached, Cordelia saw a young woman with Eliza's features waiting on the porch. "That's Emily," Eliza said warmly. "She's been so excited to meet you. We don't get many visitors out here, especially young women." Emily Monroe bounded down the steps as the wagon came to a stop, her blonde hair caught in a practical braid and her smile welcoming. "You must be Miss Jenkins. Mother told me all about you." "I'm so sorry about your father and the school, but I'm delighted you'll be staying with us." She spoke rapidly, seemingly unconcerned about Cordelia's inability to respond in kind. Cordelia smiled shyly, reaching for her slate to write a greeting. "Oh, Mother explained about your slate." "What a clever solution." Emily peered at Cordelia's written hello with genuine interest. "Your handwriting is lovely, much neater than mine. Father says my letters look like chicken scratches." Yates lifted Cordelia's bag from the wagon. "Where would you like Miss Jenkins to stay, Mrs. Monroe?" "In the blue room, I think. It has a nice view of the mountains." Eliza turned to Cordelia. "I hope you'll be comfortable there. It's not fancy, but it's clean and quiet." As they entered the house, Cordelia was struck by its homey atmosphere. Unlike many prosperous homes she'd visited, the Monroes' dwelling prioritized comfort over display. Books and needlework sat on side tables, landscape paintings adorned the walls, and well-worn furniture invited relaxation rather than formal posture. Emily chatted amiably as she led Cordelia upstairs to a pleasant bedroom painted a soft blue, with white curtains fluttering at the open window. Yates set her bag just inside the door, his eyes meeting Cordelia's briefly. "I'll leave you ladies to get settled," he said. "Miss Jenkins, if you need anything, just let any of us know." After he'd gone, Emily helped Cordelia unpack, exclaiming over her books and asking questions that required only nodding or head shaking to answer. Her easy acceptance of Cordelia's silence was refreshing after months of awkward interactions in town. "Mother says you're a teacher's daughter," Emily said, hanging a dress in the wardrobe. "I love to read, but I've never had much formal schooling." "Just what Mother could teach me between ranch chores." She looked at Cordelia hopefully. "Perhaps while you're here, you might help me with my literature. I'm trying to understand Shakespeare, but it's dreadfully confusing sometimes." Cordelia nodded, pleased at the prospect of being useful rather than merely tolerated. She wrote on her slate, "I would enjoy that very much." "Wonderful," Emily beamed. "Now you must be exhausted after everything that's happened. Would you like to rest before supper?" "Mother's making her famous beef stew, and Mr. Kingsley always eats with us, along with our foreman, Mr. Rodriguez." The mention of Yates caused an unexpected flutter in Cordelia's stomach, which she firmly suppressed. She wrote, "A short rest would be welcome. Thank you for your kindness." "It's nothing," Emily insisted. "I'm just happy to have another woman near my age around. It gets terribly lonely out here sometimes, with only cattle and cowboys for company." She grinned mischievously. "Though some of the cowboys aren't bad to look at, particularly Mr. Kingsley." Cordelia felt a blush rise to her cheeks, which Emily noticed with delight. "Oh, you think so too, I knew it. He's quite handsome, isn't he? And those eyes. But don't worry, I won't tell a soul." She patted Cordelia's hand conspiratorially. "I'll come fetch you for supper in about an hour." Rest well. Left alone, Cordelia sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events and Emily's enthusiastic welcome. The girl's open friendliness was disarming after months of being treated as an oddity in Silver Creek, and her teasing about Yates. Cordelia shook her head, chiding herself for even entertaining such thoughts. She was here out of necessity, not to develop inappropriate feelings for a cowboy she barely knew. Yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, the way he seemed to understand her without words, the respect in his eyes when he looked at her. She unpacked the portrait of her mother, placing it on the bedside table. Catherine Jenkins smiled back at her, forever frozen at 35, her eyes so like Cordelia's own, full of warmth and mischief. "What would you think of all this, Mother?" Cordelia thought, tracing the frame with her fingertip. The familiar ache of loss washed over her, accompanied by the guilt that had become its constant companion. If only she'd woken sooner that night, smelled the smoke earlier, perhaps her mother would still be alive, and her own voice wouldn't have been silenced by horror. Exhaustion overtook her, and Cordelia lay back on the bed, closing her eyes against the memories. She drifted into an uneasy sleep, where flames danced behind her eyelids and a familiar voice called her name, just out of reach. She woke to a gentle knock, and Emily's cheerful voice announcing that supper was ready. Straightening her hair and splashing water on her face from the basin provided, Cordelia took a deep breath, steadying herself for the social interaction ahead. The dining room was warm and inviting, with a large oak table set for 6. Marcus Monroe, a barrel-chested man with a generous mustache and the same kind eyes as his wife, welcomed Cordelia heartily. "Miss Jenkins, delighted to have you with us. Any friend of Benjamin's is welcome at our table." He gestured to a weathered man of about 50 standing nearby. "This is Carlos Rodriguez, our foreman, been with us since we started the ranch." The foreman nodded respectfully. "Señorita Jenkins, welcome to Rockingham." "And of course, you know Yates," Marcus continued as the cowboy entered from what appeared to be a washroom, his hair damp and his face freshly shaved. Yates nodded to Cordelia, pulling out a chair for her before taking his own seat across the table. "Miss Jenkins." The meal proceeded with a casualness that surprised Cordelia. In Silver Creek, dining was often a formal affair even in modest homes, with conversation carefully modulated and topics strictly controlled. Here, Marcus and Carlos discussed cattle prices and breeding stock while Emily regaled her mother with news from her friend at a neighboring ranch. No one seemed bothered by Cordelia's silence, nor did they make awkward attempts to include her in ways that highlighted her disability. Occasionally, she would catch Yates watching her, his expression thoughtful. When their eyes met, he didn't look away embarrassed, as most people did. Instead, he'd offer a small smile before returning to his meal or responding to something Marcus had said. After the dishes were cleared, a task in which everyone participated, to Cordelia's surprise they gathered in the sitting room. Emily brought out a checkerboard, challenging her father to a game while Eliza settled with her needlework. Carlos excused himself to check on a mare about to foal, leaving Cordelia somewhat at loose ends. She was considering retrieving one of her books when Yates approached, holding a deck of cards. "You play rummy, Miss Jenkins?" he asked, his voice low enough that it didn't interrupt the others' activities. Cordelia nodded, grateful for the distraction. They settled at a small table by the window, where the last of the evening light provided enough illumination for their game. As Yates dealt the cards, he spoke casually. "My sister Elizabeth loved card games, said they were perfect because everyone had to look at their cards anyway, so no one noticed if she missed something that was said." Cordelia looked up, intrigued by this mention of his sister. She picked up her slate. "Your sister is deaf." "Was," Yates corrected gently. "She passed away 3 years ago, pneumonia," Cordelia wrote quickly. "I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, she was special, taught me more about courage than anyone I've ever known." He arranged his cards, seemingly focused on the game, but his voice carried emotion he wasn't trying to hide. "People underestimated her because she couldn't hear. Their mistake." Cordelia understood completely. She wrote, "People see what's missing, not what's there." Yates read her words and nodded, meeting her gaze with such intensity that Cordelia felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Exactly," he said softly, "but not everyone." The game proceeded in comfortable silence, interspersed with occasional comments from Yates about the ranch or questions that Cordelia could answer with a nod or shake of her head. It was the most relaxed interaction she'd had with anyone outside her father in years. As they played, Cordelia became aware of the domesticity of the scene, the family engaged in evening pursuits, the soft lamplight, the occasional laughter from Emily when her father made a poor move in their game. It was a kind of contentment she'd forgotten existed, a warmth that reached beyond the physical comfort of the room. When the games concluded and the evening drew to a close, Eliza showed Cordelia back to her room, providing extra blankets against the night chill. "Sleep well, dear," she said kindly. "And please consider our home yours for as long as you need it." Alone in the blue room, Cordelia prepared for bed, her mind replaying the events of the day. As she blew out the lamp and settled beneath the quilts, she realized with surprise that for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, she hadn't felt pitied or out of place. The Monroes and Yates Kingsley had treated her as a person first, her silence merely an aspect of who she was rather than a defining characteristic. It was a novel feeling, and one that followed her into dreams far more peaceful than those that had haunted her afternoon rest. The next week fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Each morning after breakfast, Yates would drive Cordelia into town to visit her father, whose recovery was steady but slow. Dr. Simmons had made it clear that Benjamin's lungs needed time to heal, and any attempt to rush his convalescence could lead to complications. During these drives, Cordelia found herself relaxing in Yates's company. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with endless chatter, as so many did around her. Instead, he would occasionally point out wildlife or comment on the changing landscape as summer deepened, allowing comfortable quiet to exist between his observations. Sometimes he would tell her stories about his sister Elizabeth or his childhood in Nebraska. Cordelia listened, finding in his tales echoes of her own experiences, the frustration of being misunderstood, the small triumphs that others took for granted, the unexpected moments of connection. In town, people took note of their daily arrivals, and gossip inevitably followed. Cordelia pretended not to notice the whispers as Yates escorted her to the doctor's office, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching it, a gesture of support that respected her independence. "The mute girl and the cowboy," she once overheard Mrs. Patterson murmur to Mrs. Green outside the general store. "Quite the odd pair." "He must be a patient man," Mrs. Green replied with a meaningful look. "Or perhaps he appreciates a woman who can't talk back." Their laughter followed Cordelia into the doctor's office, stinging more than she cared to admit. Yates, walking beside her, had clearly heard as well. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing until they were inside. "Pay them no mind, Miss Jenkins," he said quietly as they waited for Dr. Simmons to finish with another patient. "Small minds occupy themselves with small thoughts." Cordelia appreciated his attempt at comfort, but the women's words had struck a nerve. She'd grown accustomed to being seen as defective, but the implication that Yates might value her for her silence rather than despite it was a new hurt. She reached for her slate. "You needn't escort me every day. I know you have work at the ranch." Yates studied her face, seeming to read the insecurity behind her words. "Marcus understands, and I enjoy the drive." He hesitated, then added, "and the company." Before Cordelia could respond, Dr. Simmons appeared, ushering them into the examination room where Benjamin sat propped up in bed, looking markedly better than he had the previous day. "Cordy," he exclaimed, opening his arms for an embrace. "And Mr. Kingsley. Good of you to bring my daughter." "How are you feeling, Mr. Jenkins?" Yates asked, hanging back as Cordelia rushed to her father's side. "Stronger every day," Benjamin replied. "Dr. Simmons says I might be able to go home by the end of next week if I continue to improve." The news brought mixed feelings for Cordelia. She was overjoyed at her father's recovery, of course, but the prospect of returning to their isolated existence in town, away from the warmth of the Monroe household and the daily rides with Yates, left her with an unexpected sense of loss. "That's excellent news, sir," Yates said sincerely. "I'll leave you two to visit. Miss Jenkins, I'll return in an hour to drive you back to the ranch." After he'd gone, Benjamin studied his daughter's face. "The Monroes are treating you well." Cordelia nodded enthusiastically, writing on her slate, "They're very kind. Emily is teaching me to ride." "To ride? A horse?" Benjamin looked surprised, then chuckled. "Well, I suppose that's ranch life for you, and Mr. Kingsley, he's been attentive." Cordelia felt heat rise to her cheeks at her father's perceptive question. She wrote carefully, "He's been a perfect gentleman, drives me to town each day as a favor to the Monroes." Benjamin hummed noncommittally. "He strikes me as a serious young man, responsible. Not like some of these drifters who pass through." Cordelia didn't respond, unwilling to encourage her father's obvious train of thought. Instead, she wrote about Emily's Shakespeare lessons and Eliza's excellent cooking, steering the conversation to safer topics. Later, as Yates drove her back to the ranch, Cordelia found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hat shadowed his eyes, the slight curl at the nape of his neck where his hair needed trimming. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced at her. "Something on your mind, Miss Jenkins?" She hesitated, then wrote on her slate. "Why are you so kind to me?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. He slowed the horses, giving the matter proper consideration. "At first, it was because you reminded me of Elizabeth not in looks, but in the way you hold yourself against the world's judgment." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But now it's because I've come to admire you, your strength, your intelligence. The way you've refused to let silence define you." His honesty left Cordelia breathless. She hadn't expected such a forthright answer, nor the emotion behind it. She wrote again, "Most men would want a wife who could speak to them, bear their children, run their household." "Most men are fools," Yates replied simply. "A voice is just one way to communicate. You say more with your expressions and your written words than most people do with hours of empty chatter." The wagon crested a small hill, and the rocking M came into view in the distance, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney against the backdrop of mountains turning golden in the late afternoon sun. They traveled in silence for several minutes, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. Finally, Cordelia wrote, "My father will be released next week. I know." Yates kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Will you be glad to return home?" She considered the question carefully before writing. Home isn't always a place. Yates read her words, and a smile, small but genuine, curved his lips. "No," he agreed softly. "It isn't." That evening, as the Monroes and their guests gathered for supper, an unexpected visitor arrived. Reverend Harper, hat in hand, stood in the doorway looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Reverend," Eliza exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "What a surprise! Please come in. We were just sitting down to supper." "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe, but I won't intrude." "I've come to speak with Miss Jenkins." His eyes found Cordelia at the table. "I've just come from visiting your father, my dear. He asked me to bring you news." Cordelia rose, apprehension tightening her chest. Had her father's condition worsened? The Reverend seemed to read her concern. "Oh, it's nothing dire. Quite the opposite. The town council met today regarding the schoolhouse. They've decided to rebuild immediately, and they've offered your father a cottage to use until the work is complete. It belongs to the widow Stevens. She's visiting her sister in Denver and won't return until fall." Relief washed over Cordelia, followed quickly by realization. If a cottage was available, there was no reason for her to remain at the Rockingham. She and her father could resume their normal lives much sooner than expected. "That's wonderful news," Marcus said, rising to shake the Reverend's hand. "Benjamin's a fine teacher. The town needs him." "Indeed," Reverend Harper agreed, though his eyes remained on Cordelia. "Dr. Simmons believes Benjamin can be moved to the cottage tomorrow. He'll still need care, of course, but he can continue his recovery there. I've taken the liberty of informing Mrs. Patterson and the other ladies of the Aid Society. They'll arrange a schedule for bringing meals and checking on his needs." Cordelia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Everything was happening so quickly. She reached for her slate, but the Reverend continued before she could write a response. "I've brought a wagon to take you into town, Miss Jenkins. You can gather your father's things and prepare the cottage this evening. The ladies have already aired it out and stocked the pantry." The presumption in his tone was clear. He expected her to leave immediately. Cordelia glanced around the table, at the Monroes' kind faces and Yates's carefully neutral expression. Emily spoke up, indignant on her new friend's behalf. "But Cordelia hasn't even finished her supper. Surely this can wait until morning." "Emily," her mother cautioned softly, before turning to the Reverend. "Reverend Harper, you're welcome to join us for the meal while Cordelia considers the arrangement. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Monroe, but there's much to be done." Benjamin was quite clear that he wanted Cordelia to prepare the cottage tonight, so it's ready when he arrives tomorrow. The Reverend's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure Miss Jenkins is eager to see her father properly settled." Cordelia felt trapped. She didn't want to appear ungrateful for the town's assistance or unwilling to care for her father. Yet the Reverend's high-handed manner and obvious eagerness to remove her from the ranch rankled. She wrote quickly, "I need to pack my things." "Of course," Eliza said, understanding in her eyes. "Emily, why don't you help Cordelia?" "Reverend, please at least have some coffee while you wait." As Cordelia and Emily climbed the stairs to the blue room, Emily couldn't contain her frustration. "That man, acting like he has the right to order you about. Father says he's had his eye on you since you arrived in Silver Creek." Cordelia sighed, opening her carpetbag and beginning to pack her few belongings. It was true that Reverend Harper had shown a marked interest in her, despite or perhaps because of her silence. Her father encouraged the attention, seeing in the Reverend a secure future for his daughter. "You don't have to go," Emily said, watching Cordelia fold a shawl. "Father would speak to the Reverend. You could stay until Mr. Jenkins is fully recovered." Cordelia shook her head, writing on her slate, "Father needs me, it's my duty." "What about what you need?" Emily pressed, sitting on the bed beside the carpet bag. "You've seemed happier here, especially when Yates is around." Cordelia couldn't deny it. In the short time she'd spent at the Rockingham, she'd experienced a freedom and acceptance she hadn't known since before her mother's death. The thought of returning to town, to the whispers and pitying glances, to Reverend Harper's persistent attention, filled her with dread. But her father came first, he always had, she wrote. "Please thank your parents for their kindness, I won't forget it." Emily sighed dramatically. "Well, you must promise to visit, and we'll come to town often. Mother needs supplies, and I'm sure Yates will find reasons to ride in regularly." The mention of Yates sent a pang through Cordelia's heart. Their conversation in the wagon that afternoon had hinted at possibilities she'd scarcely allowed herself to imagine. Now, it seemed those possibilities would remain unexplored. When her bag was packed, they returned downstairs to find the Reverend standing impatiently by the door while Marcus engaged him in conversation about the church roof. Yates was nowhere to be seen. "Ah, there you are," Reverend Harper said, relief evident in his voice. "We should be on our way before it gets too dark," Cordelia wrote on her slate, holding it up for the Monroes. "Thank you for everything, you've been so kind." "You're welcome here any time, dear," Eliza said warmly, embracing her. "And we expect to see you at Sunday dinner once Benjamin is settled." Marcus shook her hand firmly. "It's been a pleasure, Miss Jenkins. Remember what I said about that mare, she'd be perfect for a beginning rider like yourself." Emily hugged her tightly, whispering, "This isn't goodbye." "Not really." As the Reverend ushered her toward the door, Cordelia glanced around one last time, hoping to catch a glimpse of Yates. Had he left to avoid an awkward farewell? The thought hurt more than she expected. Outside, the Reverend's wagon waited, a lantern hanging from its side casting a pool of yellow light in the gathering dusk. As he helped Cordelia up onto the seat, a figure emerged from the shadows of the barn. "Reverend," Yates called, approaching with long strides. "Might I have a word with Miss Jenkins before you depart?" The Reverend frowned. "We really should be going. It's getting late, and just a moment," Yates insisted, his tone brooking no argument. "It won't take long." Reluctantly, the Reverend stepped aside, though he remained within earshot as Yates came to stand beside the wagon. "Miss Jenkins," Yates began, looking up at Cordelia with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I wanted to wish you and your father well in your new arrangement." Cordelia nodded, disappointed despite herself. She'd hoped for something more, then Yates lowered his voice, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "I meant what I said this afternoon. Every word, and I'll be in town tomorrow to help move your father." "Perhaps we could continue our conversation then?" Hope bloomed in Cordelia's chest as she met his steady gaze. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Yates stepped back, tipping his hat formally. "Safe journey, Miss Jenkins." As the wagon pulled away from the Rockingham, Cordelia found herself looking forward rather than back. The Reverend might believe he was escorting her away from inappropriate influences, but in reality, he was merely facilitating the next chapter of a story that was just beginning to unfold. The widow Stevens's cottage proved to be a pleasant surprise, small but well-maintained, with a garden of late summer flowers bordering the front path and cheerful yellow curtains at the windows. Inside, the ladies of the Aid Society had indeed been busy. Fresh linens adorned the beds, the floors were swept, and the pantry contained enough food to last a week. Reverend Harper hovered as Cordelia inspected the rooms, his commentary a constant accompaniment to her silent assessment. "Mrs. Patterson arranged the bedroom for your father, the one with the eastern exposure for the morning light, and this room will be yours." He gestured to a small but cozy chamber with a narrow bed and a writing desk beneath the window. "The ladies thought you might appreciate a place for your written communications." Cordelia nodded politely, though the patronizing tone grated on her nerves. She wrote on her slate, "It's perfect. Please convey my thanks to everyone." "I'll do that," the Reverend promised, watching as she set her carpet bag on the bed. "Miss Jenkins, Cordelia, I hope you know that I've only your best interests at heart. Your father worries about your future, as do I." Cordelia kept her expression neutral as she wrote. "I appreciate your concern. It's been a long day, and tomorrow will be busy with Father's arrival." The Reverend took the hint, albeit reluctantly. "Of course, I'll call tomorrow afternoon to see how you're both settling in." At the door he paused. "I noticed Mr. Kingsley seems attentive to you. I feel obliged to caution you as your spiritual advisor. Cowboys aren't known for their stability or commitment. Your father hopes for a more secure future for you." Anger flashed through Cordelia at his presumption, but she maintained her composure, writing only, "Good night, Reverend, thank you for the ride." After he'd finally departed, Cordelia leaned against the closed door, exhaling slowly. The cottage was lovely, and she was grateful for the town's generosity, but it felt confining after the open spaces of the Rockingham. Or perhaps it was the Reverend's hovering presence that had made it seem so. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her mother's portrait on the bedside table as always. Then she prepared the larger bedroom for her father, turning down the covers and arranging his nightclothes where he could easily reach them. Finally, she explored the kitchen, familiarizing herself with its layout and contents. When everything was ready, Cordelia sat at the small table by the kitchen window, watching the moon rise over the silhouettes of Silver Creek's buildings. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to contemplate a future different from the one she'd resigned herself to, one that included meaningful connection, understanding, perhaps even love. The thought both exhilarated and terrified her. Yates Kingsley had awakened feelings she'd buried alongside her voice, but was she brave enough to embrace them? And what of her father, who clearly hoped to see her settled with someone like Reverend Harper, respectable, stable, established in the community? These questions followed her into uneasy dreams, where silent conversations played out beneath wide Wyoming skies, and blue eyes that saw beyond her silence beckoned her toward an uncertain future. Morning brought a flurry of activity as Benjamin Jenkins was installed in the cottage with much fuss from the ladies of Silver Creek. Dr. Simmons supervised the move, ensuring his patient wasn't overtaxed by the short journey from his office to the widow's home. True to his word, Yates arrived to help, carrying Benjamin's trunk and assisting in settling him comfortably in his new quarters. Cordelia noticed how her father's initial wariness toward the cowboy had softened into something approaching respect, though he still watched their interactions with a father's protective eye. "You've been very kind, Mr. Kingsley," Benjamin said, as Yates adjusted the pillows behind his back. "I don't know how we can repay you." "No repayment necessary, sir," Yates replied easily, "just doing what neighbors do. Nevertheless, I hope you'll join us for supper sometime soon, once I'm more on my feet, of course." Cordelia, arranging medicines on the bedside table, glanced up in surprise at her father's invitation. It was the first time Benjamin had shown any interest in cultivating Yates's acquaintance beyond necessity. "I'd be honored, Mr. Jenkins," Yates said, his eyes finding Cordelia's across the room. "Just send word when you're feeling up to company." After the doctor and the last of the well-wishers had departed, Yates lingered, ostensibly checking that the stove was drawing properly. Benjamin had dozed off, exhausted by the morning's activities, leaving Cordelia and Yates alone in the small kitchen. "The cottage suits you," Yates observed quietly, watching as Cordelia prepared tea. "Though Emily's already complaining about your absence, says the ranch is too quiet without you." Cordelia smiled, setting down the teapot to write. "I miss her too, and the ranch, it was peaceful there." "You found peace in a house with a chattering 18-year-old, a boisterous rancher, and cowboys tramping in and out at all hours." Yates's eyes crinkled with amusement. She wrote again, "Different kind of peace, not silence, but acceptance." Yates's expression sobered as he read her words. "I understand." He hesitated, then added, "Miss Jenkins, Cordelia, I meant to speak with you about something. Yesterday in the wagon, a knock at the door interrupted them. Cordelia went to answer it, finding Reverend Harper on the doorstep with a covered dish. "Mrs. Hollister's chicken pie," he announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She insisted it would be just the thing for an invalid. His smile faltered when he spotted Yates in the kitchen. "Mr. Kingsley, still here, I see." "Just leaving, Reverend," Yates replied evenly. "Wanted to make sure everything was in working order before I headed back to the ranch." The Reverend nodded stiffly, setting the pie on the kitchen table. "How thoughtful. Well, I'm sure Miss Jenkins appreciates your assistance, but she has plenty of help now. The ladies and I will ensure that she and her father want for nothing." The dismissal was obvious, as was the territorial message beneath it. Yates glanced at Cordelia, who stood uncomfortably between the two men, frustration evident in the tightness around her eyes. "I'll be going then," Yates said, reaching for his hat. "Miss Jenkins, please let me know if you need anything else." Mr. Jenkins extended an invitation to supper once he's feeling stronger. "I look forward to it." This piece of information clearly displeased the Reverend, whose smile became fixed. How kind of Benjamin, though he should focus on his recovery before entertaining. "I'm sure Mr. Kingsley understands." "I understand a great deal, Reverend," Yates replied, a hint of steel beneath his polite tone. "Miss Jenkins, good day." After he'd gone, the Reverend turned to Cordelia with an expression of concern. "My dear, I hope you don't think me presumptuous, but I feel obliged to caution you about Mr. Kingsley. Your father is in a vulnerable state and well, your unique situation makes you particularly susceptible to certain kinds of attention." Cordelia's eyes flashed with indignation. She snatched up her slate, writing furiously, "My unique situation does not make me naive or foolish. Mr. Kingsley has been nothing but respectful and kind." The Reverend read her message with a patronizing smile. "Of course, my dear, I'm simply concerned about appearances." A young, unmarried woman entertaining a cowboy while her father is indisposed. People talk, you know. Before Cordelia could respond, a weak voice called from the bedroom. "Cordy, is someone here?" The Reverend patted her arm condescendingly. "You attend to your father, I'll see myself out. But do consider what I've said. Your reputation is precious and once lost, not easily regained." As he left, Cordelia stood rooted to the spot, fury and frustration warring within her. The Reverend's thinly veiled warnings were as much about staking his claim as they were about protecting her reputation. He viewed her as a possession to be acquired, her silence an attractive feature rather than an impediment, as it ensured a compliant, unargumentative wife. With effort, she composed herself before going to her father's bedside. Benjamin was awake but drowsy, his eyes struggling to focus. "Was that Kingsley I heard?" he asked, reaching for the glass of water Cordelia offered. She nodded, helping him sit up to drink. "Good man," Benjamin murmured, surprising Cordelia again. "Reminds me of myself at his age, determined, honorable." He settled back against the pillows with a sigh. The Reverend was here too. Cordelia nodded again, trying to keep her expression neutral. Benjamin studied her face, his own expression thoughtful. "Harper's a fine man in his way, respected, would provide well." He paused, then added softly, "But he doesn't see you, does he? Not really." Tears sprang to Cordelia's eyes at her father's unexpected perception. She reached for her slate, writing with trembling hands. "No, he doesn't." "And Kingsley?" She hesitated, then wrote simply, "He does." Benjamin closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. "Your mother would say that's what matters most." His voice grew fainter as sleep claimed him. "Being seen for who you are." Cordelia sat beside her father until his breathing deepened into sleep, her mind churning with his words. She'd assumed Benjamin favored the Reverend's suit, that he viewed Yates with suspicion if not outright disapproval. Had she misjudged her father's wishes for her future? The next few days settled into a routine centered around Benjamin's recovery. The ladies of Silver Creek visited regularly, bringing food and town gossip in equal measure. Cordelia cared for her father, managed the household, and endured the Reverend's daily visits with as much grace as she could muster. Yates didn't call at the cottage, though Cordelia occasionally spotted him in town when she ventured out for supplies. He would tip his hat politely, exchange pleasantries with her via her slate, but the meaningful conversation he'd attempted in the kitchen remained unfinished. She told herself it was for the best. Whatever connection they'd begun to forge at the Rocking M was probably just a product of proximity and her own lonely heart. Yet she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened when she caught sight of him outside the general store, or how she found herself lingering at the window in hopes of seeing him ride past. A week after Benjamin's move to the cottage, Emily Monroe came calling, bringing a basket of fresh eggs and a wealth of ranch news. "Father says the north pasture is looking better after the rain," she chattered as she helped Cordelia prepare lunch. "And Yates broke that wild Mustang everyone said couldn't be tamed. You should have seen it, Cordelia. The horse was bucking something fierce, but Yates just stayed on like he was part of the animal." Cordelia smiled at Emily's enthusiasm, though the mention of Yates sent the familiar flutter through her stomach. "He asks about you, you know," Emily continued, watching Cordelia's face closely. "Every day, wants to know how you and your father are getting on." Cordelia kept her expression neutral as she wrote on her slate, "That's very thoughtful of him." "Thoughtful?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Cordelia Jenkins, for a smart woman you can be remarkably dense. The man is sweet on you, anyone with eyes can see it." Heat rose to Cordelia's cheeks as she shook her head emphatically, writing, "Don't be ridiculous, he's just being kind." "Kind doesn't make a man ride into town at dawn before his chores just to catch a glimpse of you at the market," Emily countered. "Kind doesn't make him turn down Isabel Harper's invitation to Sunday dinner 3 weeks running." Cordelia's eyes widened in surprise. Isabel Harper was the Reverend's niece, a pretty, vivacious girl of 20 who had arrived in Silver Creek the previous month to keep house for her uncle. That she had set her sights on Yates was news to Cordelia. "Oh yes," Emily nodded, seeing Cordelia's reaction. "She's been positively throwing herself at him. Mother says it's embarrassing to watch, but Yates won't give her the time of day." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "And do you know why?" Before Cordelia could respond, the front door opened and Reverend Harper entered without knocking, Isabel at his side. "Miss Jenkins, good afternoon," he called, then stopped short at the sight of Emily. "Miss Monroe, what a surprise." "Reverend, Miss Harper." Emily's greeting was polite but cool. "I was just bringing some eggs from the ranch. Cordelia's been kind enough to show me her mother's recipe for custard." Isabel Harper stepped forward, a vision of feminine charm in a blue dress that matched her eyes perfectly. "How lovely," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. "Uncle says Miss Jenkins is quite accomplished despite her limitations." Cordelia stiffened at the thinly veiled insult, but Emily jumped to her defense. "Cordelia's accomplished by anyone's standards," she said firmly. "She's been teaching me Shakespeare, and Father says my understanding of the texts has improved remarkably." The Reverend cleared his throat. "Yes, well, education is certainly important for young ladies within reason. Speaking of which, Isabel has brought some literature for Mr. Jenkins. Religious tracts that might bring comfort during his convalescence." Isabel held up a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I selected them myself." "Is Mr. Jenkins receiving visitors today?" Cordelia wrote on her slate. "He's resting now. I'll give him the tracts when he wakes." "We won't disturb him then," the Reverend said, though disappointment flickered across his face. "Isabel, leave the package with Miss Jenkins." As Isabel handed over the parcel, she said sweetly, "I ran into Mr. Kingsley in town yesterday. Such a handsome man, don't you think? He's promised to teach me to ride properly when he has time." She glanced at Cordelia with barely concealed triumph. "Uncle says cowboys make poor husbands, but surely there's no harm in riding lessons." The implication was clear. Isabel was staking her claim on Yates, and she wanted Cordelia to know it. The petty maneuver might have worked had Cordelia not caught the flash of panic in the other woman's eyes when Emily mentioned that Yates had declined her dinner invitations. Cordelia merely nodded politely, refusing to show any reaction. She wrote, "Mr. Kingsley is an excellent horseman. You'll learn much from him." The Reverend, sensing the undercurrents in the conversation, intervened smoothly. "We won't keep you ladies from your baking. Please give Benjamin my regards when he wakes. I'll call again tomorrow." After they'd gone, Emily exploded with indignation. The nerve of that girl, pretending Yates has shown her special attention when everyone knows he can barely stand to be in the same room with her. Cordelia sighed, writing, "It doesn't matter. Mr. Kingsley is free to teach riding to whomever he pleases." "But don't you see?" Emily persisted. "She's trying to make you jealous because she knows Yates cares for you. She's been watching how he looks at you in town." Cordelia shook her head, unwilling to entertain such hopeful notions. Even if Yates did harbor some affection for her, what future could there be in it? A cowboy and a mute schoolteacher's daughter made an unlikely pair, especially with the Reverend actively working against any connection between them. Yet as she and Emily returned to their baking, Cordelia couldn't help but wonder about Yates's refusal of Isabel's invitations, or his early morning rides into town that coincided with her own trips to the market. Could Emily be right? And if she was, what did Cordelia intend to do about it? The answer came sooner than expected. The following evening, as Cordelia sat reading to her father in the small parlor, a knock sounded at the door. Benjamin, who had progressed to sitting up for longer periods and even taking short walks around the cottage, looked up from his book. "Expecting someone, Cordy?" She shook her head, setting aside her volume of Tennyson to answer the door. To her surprise, Yates Kingsley stood on the threshold, hat in hand, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "Miss Jenkins," he said, nodding respectfully. "I hope I'm not intruding. I've come to speak with your father if he's receiving visitors." Cordelia blinked in surprise before stepping aside to let him enter. She led him to the parlor where Benjamin straightened in his chair, eyebrows raised at the unexpected guest. "Mr. Kingsley, this is a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Jenkins," Yates greeted, taking the seat Cordelia indicated. "You're looking much improved, sir. Getting stronger every day thanks to my daughter's excellent care." Benjamin set his book aside, studying the younger man with interest. "What brings you here this evening?" "Not that you need a specific reason to call, of course." Yates glanced at Cordelia, who had retreated to a chair near the window, before addressing Benjamin directly. "Actually, sir, I do have a specific purpose in mind. I'd like to speak with you about a matter of some importance." "A personal matter." Benjamin's eyes darted to his daughter, understanding dawning in his expression. "I see," he said slowly. "Cordelia, perhaps you could make some coffee for our guest." Cordelia hesitated, reluctant to leave but recognizing her father's gentle dismissal. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, though she remained within earshot of the parlor. As she prepared the coffee pot, she strained to hear the conversation between her father and Yates. Their voices were low, but in the quiet cottage, fragments reached her ears. "Admire your daughter greatly," Yates was saying. "Serious intentions," her father responded, never more serious about anything. "Difficult life, her condition." "Not a condition, sir, part of who she is." Cordelia's hands trembled as she measured coffee into the pot. Was Yates asking for permission to court her? The possibility seemed both wonderful and terrifying. When she returned to the parlor with a tray bearing coffee and cups, both men fell silent, watching her with expressions that revealed nothing of their discussion. She served the coffee, acutely aware of Yates's eyes following her movements. "Cordelia," Benjamin said after taking a sip, "Mr. Kingsley has something he wishes to discuss with you. I've given him my blessing to do so." Heart pounding, Cordelia looked to Yates, who set his cup aside and rose from his chair. He crossed to where she sat, then, to her astonishment, lowered himself to one knee before her. "Miss Jenkins, Cordelia," he began, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. From the first moment I saw you, I recognized something in you that called to me. A strength, a depth of character that goes beyond words. In the time I've known you, that recognition has grown into something more: admiration, respect, and yes, affection. Cordelia sat frozen, scarcely able to believe what was happening. She was dimly aware of her father watching from his chair, a mixture of emotions playing across his face. "I know this may seem sudden," Yates continued, "but life has taught me not to waste time when someone truly matters." He took a deep breath. "Cordelia Jenkins, would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you with the intention of making you my wife?" For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute. Then, with hands that shook visibly, Cordelia reached for her slate. She wrote a single word: "Why?" Yates read it, understanding the depth of insecurity behind the simple question. "Because when I look at you, I see everything I want in a partner: intelligence, courage, compassion. Because your silence speaks louder to me than any words could. Because when I imagine my future, I can't see it clearly unless you're in it." Tears filled Cordelia's eyes as she wrote again, "People will talk, they'll say you settled for less." "Let them talk," Yates said firmly. "They don't know you as I do. They don't see how your eyes light up when you're amused or how they flash when you're angry. They don't understand that your silence isn't emptiness, it's a different kind of fullness." He reached for her hand, his own warm and steady. "I'm not asking you to answer right away. Take time to consider. But know that my feelings are sincere and my intentions honorable." Cordelia glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "He's spoken to me honestly, Cordy. I believe in his sincerity." She turned back to Yates, searching his face for any hint of doubt or pity. She found only earnestness and something deeper, something that made her heart race and her breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote on her slate, "Yes." The single word transformed Yates's expression, joy breaking across his features like sunrise over the mountains. "Yes." "You'll allow me to court you?" Cordelia nodded, a smile spreading across her own face despite the tears that now spilled freely down her cheeks. Yates reached up to gently wipe away a tear with his thumb. "I promise you won't regret it," he said softly. "I may not be a man of great means or education, but I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Benjamin cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "Well, this calls for something stronger than coffee, I think." He struggled to rise from his chair, waving off Cordelia's attempt to help. "No, no, I can manage. There's a bottle of brandy the doctor prescribed for medicinal purposes. I believe this qualifies as medicinal for all of us." As Benjamin made his way slowly to the kitchen cabinet, Yates took Cordelia's hands in his. "I meant every word," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your eyes speak loud enough for me to hear everything your voice cannot say." In that moment, Cordelia believed him. For the first time since the fire that had claimed her mother and silenced her voice, she felt truly seen, truly heard. The path ahead would not be easy, there would be obstacles, both from within and without, but with Yates beside her, she no longer feared facing them. The news of Yates Kingsley's intention to court Cordelia Jenkins spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Some, like the Monroes, received it with genuine delight. Others, particularly Reverend Harper and his niece, made little effort to hide their disapproval. The town buzzed with speculation about the unlikely pair, the silent schoolteacher's daughter and the steady-eyed cowboy who seemed to understand her without words. Cordelia found herself the subject of scrutiny wherever she went. But for once, she didn't mind the attention. With Yates at her side during their carefully chaperoned outings, the whispers and stares seemed to lose their power to wound her. Their courtship proceeded with proper decorum, but genuine affection. Yates called at the cottage regularly, sometimes joining Cordelia and Benjamin for supper, other times escorting Cordelia on walks through town or rides in the countryside, always with Emily or another suitable companion in attendance. During these outings, they developed a communication all their own. Cordelia's slate remained her primary means of expression, but increasingly, Yates learned to read her expressions, the subtle movements of her hands, the tilt of her head. In turn, she came to understand his silences, the things he said with a glance or a touch that needed no verbal confirmation. On a golden afternoon in late September, they rode to a hilltop overlooking Silver Creek, Emily chattering happily as she followed at a discreet distance. Cordelia had become a competent rider under Yates's patient instruction, and she sat her mare with growing confidence as they reached the crest of the hill. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Yates said, gesturing toward the vista before them. The town lay nestled in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of mountains beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Cordelia nodded, drinking in the view. She reached for the small slate she now carried in a special pocket sewn into her riding skirt, writing, "I never saw it from this perspective before. Sometimes we need distance to appreciate what's right in front of us," Yates observed, his eyes moving from the landscape to her face. "I know I did." She tilted her head questioningly. "I'd been in Silver Creek 2 weeks before I truly saw you," he explained. "Oh, I'd noticed you around town, but I hadn't really seen you, not until that day outside the livery," Cordelia wrote. "What changed?" "Your eyes," Yates said simply. "The way they challenged everyone who dismissed you, the intelligence in them. The hurt, too, though you tried to hide it." He reached across the space between their horses to touch her hand lightly. "I saw a woman with more to say than most people who never stopped talking." Cordelia's heart swelled at his words. She wrote, "I saw someone who didn't look away. Most people do eventually." "I could never look away from you," Yates said softly. "Not then, not now, not ever." Behind them, Emily coughed delicately, reminding them of her presence. Yates straightened in his saddle, a faint blush coloring his tan cheeks. "We should head back," he said, though reluctance was evident in his tone. "Your father will be expecting you, and I promised Marcus I'd help with the new corral before sundown." As they rode back toward town, Cordelia found herself contemplating the future with a hopefulness that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Her father's health continued to improve, and plans for rebuilding the schoolhouse were well underway. Benjamin would resume teaching by winter, and life would return to normal, except that normal now included Yates Kingsley and the promise of a life she had never dared to imagine. The obstacles to their happiness weren't insignificant. Reverend Harper had made his disapproval known through thinly veiled sermons about unequal yoking and the sanctity of proper matches. Isabel Harper spread whispers suggesting that Yates was merely pitying the poor mute girl, while others questioned what kind of household a silent woman could possibly manage. But for every detractor, there seemed to be a supporter. The Monroes championed their relationship openly. Dr. Simmons remarked to anyone who would listen that he'd never seen Benjamin Jenkins look so well, attributing it to his daughter's happiness. Even Mrs. Patterson, once a reliable source of gossip about Cordelia's condition, was heard defending the match to her sewing circle. "Say what you will," she declared, "but that girl's eyes light up like lanterns when Kingsley walks into a room, and he looks at her like she hung the moon. If that's not love, I don't know what is." As autumn deepened, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons, Yates and Cordelia's courtship flourished. They developed routines and rituals that suited their unique circumstances, reading together in the cottage parlor while Benjamin dozed by the fire, riding out to the Rockingham for Sunday dinners with the Monroes, attending town socials where Yates proudly led Cordelia through simple dances that required no verbal communication. Through it all, Cordelia felt herself opening like a flower long kept in shadow. The wall of silence that had isolated her for years became less a barrier and more a unique aspect of a relationship built on understanding that transcended words. One evening in early October, as they sat on the cottage porch watching the sunset, Yates took Cordelia's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "Marcus has offered me a partnership in the Rockingham, Cordelia looked at him in surprise, writing quickly on her slate. A partnership. That's wonderful. It would mean staying in Silver Creek permanently, Yates continued. Building a life here. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I told him I needed to discuss it with you first, she wrote. With me, why? Because any decision that affects my future affects yours too, at least. I hope it does. He took a deep breath. Cordelia, we've been courting for almost 2 months now. In that time, my feelings for you have only grown stronger. I know it's proper to wait longer, but… He squeezed her hand gently. I love you. I want to marry you, to build a life with you. I don't need more time to be certain of that. Cordelia sat very still, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Yates must hear it. She'd known their courtship was leading toward marriage, but the reality of his declaration, the words, I love you, spoken so simply, so confidently, overwhelmed her. Her silence stretched longer than usual, and uncertainty flickered in Yates's eyes. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, he said quickly. I understand if you need time to. Cordelia placed her fingers gently against his lips, stopping his words. She shook her head, then reached for her slate. With trembling hands she wrote, I love you too, I don't need more time either. Relief and joy transformed Yates's expression. You'll marry me? Truly, she nodded, her own face radiant with happiness despite the tears that sprang to her eyes. Yates pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of propriety even in this moment of emotion. I promise to make you happy, he whispered against her hair, to be the kind of husband you deserve. Cordelia leaned back slightly, just enough to write on her slate. You already make me happier than I ever thought possible. Inside the cottage, Benjamin Jenkins watched through the window, a bittersweet smile on his face. He'd known this moment was coming, had, in fact, given Yates his blessing to propose when the young man had approached him the previous day. Seeing his daughter's joy now confirmed what he'd already believed. Yates Kingsley was the right man for Cordelia, perhaps the only man who could truly see beyond her silence to the remarkable woman beneath. As the couple on the porch shared a chaste but tender kiss, Benjamin turned away, giving them privacy in their moment of joy. He offered a silent prayer of gratitude that his daughter had found someone who understood what he had always known, that Cordelia's inability to speak had never diminished the power of her heart to love, or her spirit to soar. The wedding of Yates Kingsley and Cordelia Jenkins took place on a crisp November morning, with the mountains surrounding Silver Creek dusted with the first snow of the season. The ceremony was held in the newly rebuilt schoolhouse rather than the church, a decision that raised eyebrows but surprised no one familiar with Reverend Harper's barely concealed opposition to the match. Benjamin Jenkins, fully recovered and back to teaching, performed the ceremony himself, his voice strong with emotion as he pronounced the words that joined his daughter to the man who had won not only her heart but his respect. Cordelia wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her mother's locket at her throat and late autumn flowers in her hair. When it came time for her vows, a hush fell over the gathered witnesses. Many had wondered how a mute bride would manage this essential part of the ceremony. The answer was as simple as it was profound. Cordelia had worked with her father to prepare special vows that she signed with gestures Yates had learned over the months of their courtship. As her hands moved in the air between them, forming promises of love and fidelity, Yates's eyes never left hers, understanding and reciprocating every unspoken word. When Benjamin announced, "You may kiss your bride," Yates cupped Cordelia's face gently in his hands, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Your eyes have always spoken loud enough for me to hear," he said softly. "They're telling me now that you love me as I love you completely, without reservation, for all our days." Their kiss sealed a promise that needed no voice to make it binding. The celebration that followed at the Rockingham Ranch was joyous and unpretentious, reflecting the couple it honored. Marcus and Eliza Monroe had insisted on hosting, throwing open their home to friends and neighbors who wished to share in the young couple's happiness. Emily, serving as Cordelia's maid of honor, flitted among the guests, her excitement for her friend's happiness infectious. "Isn't it the most romantic thing?" she gushed to anyone who would listen. "Like something from a storybook, only better because it's real." Even some who had initially disapproved found themselves moved by the evident devotion between bride and groom. Mrs. Green, who had once laughed at the idea of a man appreciating a woman who couldn't talk back, was overheard remarking to her husband, "Well, I never thought I'd say it, but they do seem perfectly matched. The way he watches her, like he can read her mind, it's something to see." Only Reverend Harper and his niece were conspicuously absent from the festivities, having left town the previous week for an extended visit to Denver. Few mourned their absence, least of all the newlyweds, who were too absorbed in their happiness to notice who wasn't present. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the ranch yard, Yates led his bride in their first dance as husband and wife. They moved together with the easy grace of two people perfectly attuned to each other's rhythms, needing no words to communicate their movements or their joy. "Mrs. Kingsley," Yates murmured as they swayed to the music of a fiddle and guitar, "how does it feel to be a married woman?" Cordelia's eyes sparkled with mischief as she mouthed, "Wonderful." Yates's surprise was evident. "You've been practicing," he said softly. She nodded, her expression growing serious as she mouthed another word, one she had practiced countless times in private. "Yates." His eyes filled with emotion at this gift, his name on her silent lips, meant for him alone to see and understand. It was a private communion, a testament to the unique language they had built between them. "I love you," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "More than I have words to say." Cordelia's smile held all the response he needed. Later, as they departed for the small cabin Marcus had helped Yates build on a corner of the Rocking M property, their first home together, Benjamin embraced his daughter fiercely. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Cordy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So am I." Cordelia hugged him back, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. Gratitude for his love, for his understanding, for his willingness to let her find her own path to happiness. As Yates helped her into the wagon that would take them to their new home, Benjamin clasped the younger man's hand firmly. "Take care of my girl," he said, though they both knew Cordelia was more than capable of taking care of herself. "With everything I am," Yates promised. The stars were bright overhead as they drove toward their cabin, the future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming sky, boundless, filled with possibility, and perfectly understood in silence. 1 year later, Cordelia Kingsley stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Yates rode in from checking the northern pasture. Her hand rested lightly on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew stronger each day. As Yates dismounted and strode toward her, his face lighting up at the sight of her waiting, Cordelia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the whispers that had followed her through Silver Creek to the love that had given her a voice in ways she'd never imagined possible, her path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet standing here now, watching her husband cross the yard with that look in his eyes, the one that said she was seen, she was heard, she was loved completely, Cordelia knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of that journey. "Hello, beautiful," Yates said, climbing the porch steps to take her in his arms. "How are my two favorite people today?" Cordelia reached for the slate she still carried, though less frequently now that they had developed their own language of gestures and expressions. She wrote, "We missed you. Your son has been particularly active today." "Son, is it?" Yates laughed, placing his hand beside hers on her stomach. "You sound mighty certain. What if she's a daughter?" Cordelia's eyes sparkled as she wrote. "Then she'll have you wrapped around her finger within minutes of her arrival." "Just like her mother," Yates agreed, pressing a kiss to Cordelia's forehead. "Either way, this child will never doubt that they are loved and understood exactly as they are." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cordelia leaned into her husband's embrace. The silence between them was filled with all the things that mattered: love, understanding, acceptance, and the promise of a future where words were just one way among many to speak from the heart. In Silver Creek, people still sometimes referred to her as the mute woman or that silent Jenkins girl, but the whispers no longer followed her like shadows. Instead, they were eclipsed by new stories of the devoted couple at the Rocking M, of the expectant mother whose eyes spoke volumes, of the cowboy who had once said, "Your eyes speak loud enough," and had spent every day since proving he meant it. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered.